Okay, so where we left off on the last time was explaining how, parties are competing for independent voters because they can't win elections with just the 40% of their normal party, right? And 40% of Americans identify as Democrats, 40% identify as Republicans, 20% identify as independent. This has actually changed. It's probably now more like 32%, 35%, and then the remaining is independents. Um, but it kind of even proves it more. If I'm a Democrat, I can't win an election with 32%. Even if I get every single Democrat, I have to get every single Democrat and, at least probably around 18% of independents. And independents identify as moderate. And so the challenge that you run into is really revealed by this next slide, right? Which is, if you look here, I need to get 18% of independents to support me, while I also have to make sure I lock down all 32% of my Democratic base, right? And so if you look at the base, you don't see, yes, it's still, 37% of them identify as moderate, but look how many now identify as liberal, right? 22% identify as liberal, 18% slightly liberal. And so I got to make sure that all my extremely liberal, and slightly liberal people turn out. And I need to get all of those, like, I need to get 18% of independents who disproportionately identify as moderate. That can be a really tricky balancing act. And you see the same thing reflected in the Republican Party. Even more, right? Because, while 22% of Democrats identify as liberal, 40% of Republicans identify as conservative. And so I need to get all of my conservative base to show up while I also pick up, 15% moderate vote of independents. And so what we see a lot in politics today is that during the primary season, right? And we looked at this during elections, during the primary season, before the party makes its nominee, when you're only competing for your base, right? When it's only Democrats choosing between Democratic candidates to figure out who's going to be their nominee, the candidates tend to be out on the margins during the primary season, right? Democrats tend to be even more liberal during the primary season, just as Republicans tend to be even more conservative, right? I'm conservative, more conservative than that dude. Choose me. I'm the conservative candidate. And they know they have to do that in order to win the party nomination. But then once they have the nomination, candidates on both parties tend to race back to the middle. And so Republican candidates got more conservative during the primary process. And then once they lock up the nomination, they try to get back as close to the middle and moderate voters as possible. That way they're hanging on to their conservative voters that they really kind of actionized during the primary season while also trying to pick up some independent voters. This is challenging. Sometimes what happens is, Democrats will race out to the left side, to the extremely liberal side during the primary season, and then they went so far to the left during that they can't make it back to the moderate middle by election day. Voters have too much identified them as, they're socialists or they're this, and they don't win. And same thing with Republicans, right? They race so far out to be the conservative candidate during their primary process that they can't become moderate enough by election day, where they're accused too much of flip flopping, right? Or doing whatever it takes to win, but not having any conviction. This is challenging because they need to take care of their base while also picking up independent voters who tend to be disproportionately moderate. So what is the significance of party identity in America today? And let's take a look at what the charts on the left show us. And this is not incredibly recent. This is probably about a decade old, this data, but it's recent-ish. In about 2012, if you were to poll 18 to 24-year-olds and brand new voters, do you identify as Democrat or Republican? Well, more people identified as Democrat than Republican by about 12%, but neither identified, like, even if you added them both together, that's not as much, many of them as identify as independent. And so the trend you tend to see is that the younger the voter, the more likely to be independent. And as they get older, their party identities tend to become more fixed. And so you see the independent rates drop as people age. 25 to 34, that 54% has dropped to 49. And then by the time they're 35 to 44, that 49 has dropped to 40. And then by the time they're 45 to 54, that 40% has dropped to 33. And so we tend to see, with the exception of that little anomaly in the 55 to 64, that people become less independent as they get older, and they become more fixed in their party identification. But this also parallels a trend that's been happening since the 1950s, right? For much of American history, people's brand loyalty or party loyalty was rigid. And my grandmother provides a perfect example of this. My grandparents and whole family in West Virginia grew up in West Virginia during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, when it was a coal mining state. And coal mining operations were run by unions, and unions were hardcore Democratic voters. And so there's this huge tendency, and like my grandmother is a great example. My grandmother is a hardcore Democrat. Her name, I actually call her Mummel, by the way, not grandma, but Mummel is what we call my grandmother in West Virginia. My Mummel is a passionate Democrat, like has never voted for a Republican candidate in her entire life, and she's 92, right? Because she's of a generation when brand loyalty, party loyalty was strong. But since the 1950s, you can see, and particularly from 1964, look at that yellow line, right? About 24% of people from 1952 to 1964 identified as independents, but then watch what happens. From 1964, that percentage of people identifying as independents takes off. And suddenly, by 1996, 1997, we actually see the number of people who identify as independents has risen above the number of people who have identified as either Democrats or Republicans. Now, just like power when we talked about AP World History, power is finite, right? If somebody's gaining in power, then somebody else is losing. Which party seems to be losing the most? Well, if you looked at that line and you said, well, the Democrats started really strong in 1952 and have been going steadily downhill, almost in inverse of the number of people who identify as Republicans are going up, independence is going up, but the number of people who identify as Republicans has largely stayed pretty stable. And so the Democrats are losing, independents are gaining, Republicans are staying fairly stable, is the trend that I see. Now let's look at the notes, the slide. And so the significance of party identity in America today really aligns with what you learned last year in AP Psychology, right? Brands and groups and gangs and all that provide a psychological label to us. It gives us something to belong to. It is a psychological label. Belonging to a political party in America today is not a formal label in the sense that like you don't really need to do anything. Yes, you can register as a Democrat. Yes, you can register as a Republican, but you don't have to in order to vote for their candidates. And the second I wake up on a rando Tuesday and it's 7:12 in the morning, I say, ugh, and I spit and I, wipe my eyes and I say, a big yawn. And then I say, I'm a Democrat today. Then I'm a Democrat, right? There's nothing formal I need to do. I don't need to say, well, I woke up feeling inspired. Let me log on my computer and, register. And then I'm a Democrat. No, the second I wake up and say, I'm a Democrat, then I am. Because it is a psychological label, not a formal. And this label provides an image that helps shape people's party identity. Right. And so Democrats tend to be the image of more empathetic, more compassionate, more social welfare program driven, less interested in, the military complex, more interested in the environment, more for minorities, more for people's like human rights. Republicans tend to be more pro-business. They tend to be less government regulation, more freedom, if you will. And so these party images shape people's identity. And as we talked about in the beginning, where I was kind of going through the charts, there has been a strong shift away from self-identifying as Democrat to independent. They're really, the independents are not rising at the expense of the Republicans. They're largely rising at the expense of the Democrats. And today, in Well, 2020, 2021, I would venture this number is even higher. In 2012, 42% of all citizens identified as independent, probably even higher today. These are frequently younger voters, as we see in the chart at the top. Um, and because they're independent, they are far more likely to split ticket vote. Now, split ticket voting is something that has kind of come up in our course a couple times throughout the year, but we haven't really formally addressed. Essentially, what it is when you look at a ballot and you see 10 issues on the ballot, governor's office, Senate, president, and then ballot measures. If you do straight ticket voting, you are voting for all one party or the other, right? So you're voting for all Democrats or you're voting for all Republicans on all 10 of those races. That is straight ticket voting. Split ticket voting would be I vote for, a Democrat for president, a Republican for Senate, a Republican for, House of Representatives, and a Democrat for mayor. Or, it can be a split ticket even if you just split once. This is where you vote for one party for one office and another party for another. This is more common in younger voters today because they identify as independent, because they're not fixed to one party or the other. They are more likely to split their ticket. So we're going to finish here today with talking about the political organization or the organization of political parties. This question, let's take a look at it, right? We can talk about how does a company like Google organize itself? How does a company like Apple organize itself? Well, how do political parties organize themselves in the United States? And that's a more accurate metaphor because if you remember, political parties are private organizations. They are not affiliated, they're not publicly owned, they're not a part of the government. Therefore, they can organize themselves however they want to. Just like Twitter can suspend the account of Donald Trump because it's a private group and they can, choose to, you've seen the no shirts, no shoes, no service thing. Like Burger King can refuse to serve me if I come in wearing no shirt and no shoes, and Twitter can refuse to provide a platform for Donald Trump if he's not abiding by their rules. And political parties are the same thing. They're private organizations, can organize themselves however they want. So the first thing, and this is different than like a Google or an Apple, is that political parties do not organize themselves in traditional pyramid structures. So a traditional pyramid organizational structure will have, a CEO on the top, one person kind of drawing, and then there'll be kind of two or three or four, the CFO and the COO and kind of that under leadership. And then you'll have, department managers, and then you'll have supervisors and so on and so forth, where that pyramid is pointy at the top and wide at the bottom. But political parties actually are sort of inverted, sort of flipped, in the sense that the major power source of a political party is at the local level, right? And that the local and state levels of political parties actually tend to have far more power and influence than the national, right? So if it followed a traditional pyramid structure, the national party at the top would be that one single national party, the DNC or the Republican National Convention. And then there'd be 50, states, and then there'd be, 1,000 county, and so on and so forth. But in the inverted model, the 1,000 counties and the 50 states actually hold more power than the single national leadership. Taking this a little further, this gets at why we look at political parties as actually being very, very fragmented and decentralized, right? Because what does it mean to be a Republican in the state of New York versus a Republican in the state of Wyoming? Right? Republicans in Wyoming tend to be far more conservative than even Republicans in New York, who might be conservative, but not like super conservative. And so, because the local and the state level portions of the party have more power, and because these 50 states tend to be not all in the same place on that spectrum, and then if you go into the county level, it's even more fragmented. This is hard for candidates, right? Easier for candidates in some ways and harder for the others. In a sense, this makes it so candidates have more freedom because there's not a single power center telling them whether they can or cannot run under that label, right? Like the Democratic National Convention might not want a particular, let's say, like a almost like communist or socialist Democrat to run as a Democrat on the national level, but the Democratic Party in rural Vermont might be just